Yes. Okay. Yummy?
Here. Sorry, it
Well-
takes a second to unmute.
Oh, that's okay.
Okay.
Thank you, Yummy. Noel? Rita?
Here.
Thank you. Michelle? She's here. Noel?
I'm here.
Okay, thank you. And in the room, we have Ron and Joycelyn, Potter and myself.
And we also have some guests online, but they're part of the presentation, and we'll let them introduce themselves when we get to that agenda item. So if that's all right with you.
Yes, it is.
All right.
Let's go ahead and get it. I'll entertain a motion to approve the agenda. Okay, we've got a motion. I'll entertain a second.
I'll second it. This is Yummy.
Thank you, Yummy. It's been moved and seconded. All those in favor, please say aye.
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 Any opposed? Any abstain? All right. Let's go ahead and agenda. Let's go ahead and approve. I'll take a motion to approve the minutes.
Did you say you needed a motion?
Yeah, to approve the minutes.
Oh, so moved.
Thanks, Michelle. I'll take a, looking for a second.
Second.
Thank you, Rita.
And
Thank you.
hey,
Yes,
it's Michelle. Do we know that I was texting with Noelle? She is here, just where she's at is loud. So I just wanted you guys to know in case you didn't know she was here.
Thank you. Thank you. It's been moved and seconded. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Any abstain? All right. Done that, the minutes have been approved. Item number 5, personnel budget recommendation. Mr. Potter.
Oh, no, that's.
Oh, that's
we're
the
in
minutes, I'm sorry. Thought that looked funny.
Yep.
There we go. Next up is the DEI report.
And so I'll just do a real quick introduction on this and then pass this over to our auditors. So one of the things that we did, and you might remember from the director's goals, is I talked about doing some audits of internal HR systems, including our diversity, equity, and inclusion, and how that worked within our HR system. We had the opportunity to put out a request for proposal, and we heard from several different organizations and selected a group from St. Louis called Hicks Carter Hicks to take a look at our at a number of different components within Mid-Continent, but mostly back office issues. We're mostly looking at, they did look at some public facing issues, but a lot of this involves HR and other components. And so we asked them to do an audit and to look at what we do in terms of best practices, in terms of things that we might be able to do better, some things that maybe we need to improve upon, and things that maybe we do well, just like we do with our financial audit. And so with that, what I would like to do is turn the report, the agenda item, and the report itself over to Gloria and let her introduce her team and to talk about the audit. So Gloria, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. We appreciate the opportunity to work with the library. Thank you for selecting us, and we will briefly go through high level our process the findings and recommendations, and we're going to toggle between 2 other consultants that are online this afternoon as well. So it says, I guess I need permission to share my screen. So I think since someone is already sharing their screen, if you can give me permission, we can share our proposal. Okay, that should work. Looks like we're back. Okay. All right, here we go. All right. Can everybody see the screen?
Yes.
Great. Okay. We started this journey probably around January, February of this year. There's 3 core consultants that worked on this project. We're still working on this project. I'm Gloria Carter Hicks, the owner of Hicks Carter Hicks. My background is human resources, organizational development, training, and diversity, equity, and inclusion. I was the project manager. I am the project manager. 2 other team members on the call that will participate in the presentation, Dr. Erin Van Groningen and Maya Gan Bocek. Real quickly, I will ask Erin and Maya to introduce themselves and give you their background info.
Hello, everyone. As Gloria said, my name is Erin Van Groningen. I'm a senior consultant with Hicks Carter Hicks. My background is in industrial organizational psychology. I have my PhD in that from St. Louis University, where some of my focus areas were organizational development from a DEI perspective, as well as data analysis. So I will let Maya introduce herself now.
Thanks, Erin. My name is Maya Dan Bocek. I'm the Organizational Development and Training Analyst for Hicks Carter Hicks. I also have a background in industrial and organizational psychology with specialties and competencies in diversity, equity, and inclusion, organizational development, and training. And now I'm going to pass it back to Gloria.
All right. So as with any DEI audit or assessment, we look at collecting both quantitative and qualitative data. With the library, we also spoke to some of your external stakeholders, your partners in the community, but predominantly we spoke to employees internally. So this is kind of a multi-tiered process. We have stakeholder demographic review, and that included looking at your employee demographics, also looking at your customers, but mainly focusing specifically on the demographics of your employees. And then we also looked at HR policies, procedures, and processes. So we audited them against best practices, and Maya will talk more about that when she gives an overview of that information. But what's going on internally, demographic review. So we will look at things like gender, level of diversity, salaries, those kinds of things, and look at it from an equity and a diversity and inclusion lens. And then the same thing with the policies. We also had focus groups and surveys that were focus groups and interviews that were conducted as well. So we talked to internal employees, we talked to some of your stakeholders, and in addition, we had focus groups. So this was the methodology for extracting information, both quantitative and qualitative, which helped us with doing the assessment. I'm going to turn it over to Erin that will talk with you about the internal interviews that were conducted and high-level themes that we found from the interviews.
Thank you. So as Gloria mentioned, we did a number of different interviews. We looked at internal, so staff interviews, and external partners with which the library works closely with. Altogether, we did 14 interviews with 29 people. For the internal interviews, we did 6 group interviews where we typically had intact groups or individuals had similar job titles, and then 5 individual interviews. And this was done with those who were at sort of a higher level within the organization, so we could get a more 10,000 foot view. And then the focus groups, which I'll talk a little bit about later on, that's where we were able to get more frontline employees' perspectives. And then, of course, we did those 3 external partner interviews. So the way we went through identifying these interview themes is we followed best practices, a content analysis, where we took all the information provided to us by these individuals from the interviews, we grouped them together based on themes, and in the report, we laid those out based on how often or the frequency with which they came up. So all the information in the report is directly from those who participated in these interviews. Now, I obviously can't go through all the interview themes, but there were several that I want to specifically highlight. These were the ones that came up most often. So the first one here is that the library's hiring process really contributes to a lack of diversity within branch employees. Now, participants did acknowledge that there is some diversity by virtue of MCPL being a large system that covers a large geographical area, but that the staff is predominantly white and predominantly female. And there's a desire to see more diversity, specifically racial diversity within the organization. So contributing to, or some of the hiring practices that contribute to this lack of diversity is really a lack of standardized approach and consistent application between branches in the hiring process. So some of the questions utilized during hiring aren't standardized and aren't necessarily promoting DEI. We also heard that hiring managers may not have adequate coaching tools or resources to really have that focus when they look to recruit individuals and hire them. Also, the pool of applicants tends to be relatively homogeneous for two main reasons. Part of it could be that certain segments of the broader community that MCPL serves don't view the library as a place for them to work. It's seen, there's a feeling that they may see themselves as other, not necessarily feel comfortable working in the library. And part of it is also due to where jobs are posted. Jobs are typically posted in the same area, so they attract the same kind of people with similar backgrounds. So people wanted to see this hiring practice changed where jobs are posted in different areas so that there could be more of a focus on diversity, equity, inclusion, and hiring. So the second point is that the library's DEI values and vision are not clear to all employees throughout the organization. People acknowledged that there was a general sense that diversity, equity, inclusion was important via some of the past offerings, the materials, programmings within the library, and even the fact that these interviews were being done themselves. But there wasn't necessarily a cohesive understanding of what that was. People want to know what were the library's specific priorities, values, goals, and how those goals are being accomplished, what concrete steps are being taken. And people really wanted to see this woven throughout really everything that the library does. Because there isn't really a clear value and vision around diversity, equity, inclusion, there's a perception that the library tends to be more reactive to issues rather than proactive. And this was really highlighted by the issues surrounding Trans 101. People felt like if there was a clear stance on DEI, it'd be much easier for the library to react and kind of take a stand for what it believes in at the front instead of not really being sure. And employees really feel that the fact that it's not really clear what the priorities or values are. They don't know where they stand or what they should be doing themselves. So the third point there is there's a lack of ownership for and consistency of DEI initiatives. Really, nobody could point to anyone owning any previous DEI initiatives, that a lot of them were either top down or bottom up, middle out, but there was no real whole organizational approach where all those kind of approaches to DEI initiatives were taken. Because of this, initiatives tended to get started, but then there was a lack of follow through. And people really want to see this continue to actually be a part of the culture. To help create this change, people suggested an internal position at the library focused on DEI to help create and sustain this change. We also heard that communication issues can contribute to this lack of DEI progress. Specifically, we heard about a disconnect between HQ and the individual branches with different perceptions of what the main root issues were. And because there wasn't necessarily this firm understanding, these DEI initiatives tended to not be successful. And people really want to make sure that any sort of DEI approach from now on is a long-term solution, not just a short-term check the box approach. The final key interview theme that I want to highlight here from the internal interviews was the library's strengths. So specifically effort. People noted that the library is really taking steps to promote DEI internally, that they're really noticed, but people want to make sure, again, that this is a long-term focus. And staff really represents the greatest strength for the library moving forward. There's a wealth of talented, smart, capable individuals, and the library naturally attracts people who want to help others. So it's important to really leverage those strengths within the organization moving forward. So the next slide highlights the external stakeholders. And there's really three main themes here that came up across all the interviews. What we heard from these external stakeholders is that the staff is really focused on meeting the needs of the patrons. They really try to make sure that everyone feels welcome at the library, that there are programs and services that meet the needs of the community. And that was really the biggest thing that these individuals said, is continue to make sure that we're focusing on, or that the library is focusing on the needs of the community. With that being said, there was a perceived lack of commitment to DEI. And this just really stems from the fact that a lot of people weren't really sure where the library stood on DEI. They weren't sure of the philosophy. They hadn't heard a lot of public statements about where it stood on issues. They weren't really aware of the values. So making sure that these are externally communicated was highlighted as a benefit moving forward. People also noted that staff diversity is increasing. It's beginning to better reflect the communities being served. However, it was also highlighted that there's still room to grow in this area. So those are the interview themes. And next I want to talk about the focus groups themselves. So focus groups are a little bit different than the interviews. The interviews are much more, here are the questions, let's go through and answer these questions. The focus groups are much more discussion based. And what we tend to do is we group individuals that share specific characteristics with one another. So that way we can hear from specific sections or segments within the employee base. And also so that people feel more comfortable sharing their true perspective than they would if we had, kind of everyone together in these focus groups. So based on the results of the interviews, 5 groups were identified to participate in these sessions. They were employees who identified as Black or African American, employees who identified as a person of color besides African American or Black. So that involved those who identified as Latinx, Asian Pacific Islander, Middle Eastern, Indigenous person, Alaskan Native, or 2 or more races. We also had a focus group made up of white employees, a focus group of assistant managers, and a focus group of individuals who identified as members of the LGBTQ+ community. So for these first 4 focus groups, we got a de-identified list of these individuals, and we randomly select them to fill out these focus groups using a random number generator. And for the LGBTQ+ community group, we sent out an organization-wide email asking if somebody was interested to please contact us, and we would select from there. We were overwhelmed by the amount of emails of people who want to participate in this group specifically. So we had to select a few from there and then let the rest go. But again, we had about anywhere from 6 or 7 to 15 people participate in these focus groups at a time. So the next slide highlights some of the top focus group themes. Again, this is just a subsection of the top themes. And a lot of them echo what we heard in the interviews. So the first thing we heard is the community at large that MCPL serves is incredibly diverse. From branch to branch, there are really different communities. And it's important to have an approach that focuses on DEI, but is tailored and specific for each branch. Again, focusing on what those communities need and serving them where they're at. The second point, again, echoes what we heard with the interviews, is that the priorities around DEI just aren't clear or explicitly stated for the library. Again, people generally understand it's important, but they don't actually have the clear messaging. They're not sure what the values priorities are. And it doesn't really appear that there's any process process plan or implementation for these efforts. And again, people said having a full-time DEI position would be beneficial for this kind of work. The third point that we heard across every single focus group was that Trans 101 was highlighted issues around DEI. There's a feeling that senior leadership catered to louder voices rather than taking a stand for what is right, and then what was highlighted as a community need. Again, echoing this, the majority of LGBTQ+ programming, displays, and events have been met with resistance, even though participants indicated that these are based on community needs. A little bit more broadly, just DEI in general is considered as being too political, and participants wanted there to be a distinction between what is political and what is a human right, which participants felt that DEI generally fell under. With that being said, it was also indicated that intellectual freedom, while it's a core of the library, was really undercut by a lot of the responses to the issues around DEI. And then we also heard that there was a perception of issues with the board and their stance on DEI, and that the board appears not to want to not focus on DEI, and maybe even somewhat hostile to the concept. So the fourth point, Black, Indigenous, and persons of color, so BIPOC individuals working at the library, largely felt that they could not be their authentic selves in dealing with customers and coworkers. They felt like they needed to code switch or hide certain aspects of who they were because it was deemed as unprofessional. Some examples were these individuals weren't allowed to express frustration or engage in debate with their colleagues, whereas their white counterparts were allowed to. And there was also the perception that BIPOC individuals were more likely to get in trouble than their white counterparts for similar behavior. And finally, point number 5, hiring practices need to be evaluated in order to promote DEI. So a lot of what we talked about earlier, looking at the recruiting efforts to diversify the applicant pool, looking at where the jobs are posted, looking at a lot of the requirements for the position, making sure that you're assessing what's an actual bona fide job qualification, what will actually lead to success in the role, instead of assessing other things that are external and really don't have any bearing on success within the organization. And we also, under that same kind of umbrella, heard that there needs to be more work done around training on unconscious bias, making sure that these external factors don't cloud people's judgments when they're looking to hire individuals, making sure that everyone can have a fair shot and fair opportunity for employment with the library. So those are the high-level themes. Next, I'm going to turn it over to Maya to talk a little bit about the audit process.
Sure, thanks, Erin. So during the audit, we reviewed over 100 policy, practice, and procedure documentation, and we also reviewed de-identified employee data to review for any high-level inequities. So I'm going to be going over the results of both of these reviews. So first, regarding MCPL's policies and practices, much of the documentation did fulfill many DEI best practices as established by both the Global Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion benchmarks and also our own expertise in DEI. The documentation and policies are really well developed. They're thorough, they're standardized in many areas. We also know that there is additional standardization already occurring to much of the documentation that we reviewed, which is excellent progress and always a sign of continued commitment. We provided those involved with a comprehensive overview of all the documentation provided to us, but to highlight some of the main areas that we found that could be further developed, we've included 3 broad areas here. So the first is throughout the documentation, there was use of gendered language and gendered concepts. So these were things like gendered pronouns and terms. So we recommended that you swap these out for gender neutral terms such as they, them, amongst other pieces like making sure that domestic partner is a language that's consistently used as opposed to like wife and husband necessarily. So that way all different partners could be included. We also found that while most of the documentation was fairly standard, there was some potential bias and exclusion in some of the standard operating procedures. So some things that we found was that the job application needed to become more inclusive. Some of the decision-making procedures did need to be standardized a little bit more to limit bias, and also some items needed to be removed that were not inclusive or at least reworked in some way, particularly like in the hiring process. We also found that there was a need for clearly outlined DEI definitions and values. So at the time, there was a diversity and inclusion definition for both of those terms present, But we recommended including equity in there and also making sure that the definitions were broad and inclusive, so that way all people could be represented with these. We also suggested clearly stating the library's values around diversity, equity, inclusion, and this was something that came up a lot in the focus groups as well and the interviews. Moving on to the employee demographics, we analyzed and broke out employee data by race and ethnicity, gender, leadership status, and some other areas to review frequencies and average pay. It is important to note that this was a high-level overview, so a comprehensive compensation audit is still needed. So some of the DEI-related findings that we found included some gender inequity with respect to pay. Namely, women make less than men on average, despite making up the majority of the workforce. And this difference was more noticeable in those who made salaries rather than wages. We unfortunately could not look at any discrepancies in pay with those who identify as non-binary or transgender or any other identity under those umbrellas, as categories outside male and female were not used at the time. When looking into pay by race and ethnicity, we found that there were too few people of color to calculate meaningful pay averages and make conclusive statements about inequities. But regarding the frequencies, non-white individuals become less prevalent as the position level increases, and leadership in general is lacking non-white individuals. So one instance that we found this particularly notable was that there was only one BIPOC manager at the time of the analyses and no non-white assistant managers. That being said, these are all areas that can be developed going forward. So now I'm going to pass it back to Gloria to discuss recommendations based on the entire audit.
Recommendations are based on 3 areas: our experience in doing this work, also using best practices, global equity, diversity, inclusion benchmarks, and then also looking at just some general best practices from other sources. So recommendations are something that actually the library can decide what to accept based on time and resources and money. But these are some basic things that we thought were important for you to consider. And there are next steps that you should take. And you already have begun to embark upon some of these next steps. A DEI council. A DEI council is a best practice. It's a best practice that has been listed through diversityinc.com, Global Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Benchmark best practices. And a lot of organizations now are using a DEI council to help with looking at the data from the assessment and determining what are the next things that the organization is going to work on. The council also helps with leadership, with guidance from leadership, but develop a vision around DEI, a mission statement, and a value statement. And these things are also incorporated into the organization's performance expectations as well. We talked a little bit earlier about benchmark best practices. We use the Global Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion benchmarks. And some things are applicable, some things are not, but for the most part, some of the recommendations that were made actually are based on what we found from the benchmarks. We also know that further data would help you where we can involve all employees, and that is through a survey. And surveys are anonymous and confidential, and they're not the same as an employee engagement survey. A DEI survey is really focusing more on the things that we captured data on during the interviews and the focus groups and based on best practices. So high level, these are next steps. You've already identified 2 individuals to be your co-chairs for your DEI council. We are scheduled to be there in January to help with the DEI council orientation and kickoff and training. And then throughout the year, especially when councils first get started, they need additional assistance with helping them set their charter, define their mission, their vision, their values, and also really facilitating their meetings, understanding the data from the assessment, and determining what priorities is the organization going to work on next. So these are the next steps, and we wanted to leave some time to just answer some of your questions about the focus groups, the interviews, next steps, anything that you may have questions about regarding the work that we have done thus far. So I'm going to go back to questions and answers. Let me stop sharing here so I can see everyone. What questions might you have about the information we presented? We know that was pretty quickly. You worked us into your agenda this evening. We greatly appreciate that. But what questions might you have about what we presented?
Yeah, we greatly appreciate your thoroughness and your diligence at looking at this issue. It's a really great opportunity for the library in general to look at blind spots we may have from an outside point of view, as well as getting information from our employees in a more protected way for our employees. And we appreciate your hard work on that. At this point, I'd like to open it up. We have our board president here in the room, and we have several of our board members online. And I'd like to open it up for our board members. But before we do, I'd like to, as Ron always says, look at some history. The library started looking at our diversity, equity, inclusion issues way, probably more than a decade ago.
Yeah, actually, I just pulled it up. It was objective 1.4 of our strategic plan from 2006.
Yeah.
Said an ongoing basis to ensure staff reflects the diversity of the patrons it serves. And that was sort of the first time
2006.
that the board put this in writing.
Mm-hmm. And then again, it was also in our 2018 strategic plan that was adopted. So I think it's a good time to look at the efforts. We had the opportunity with COVID to pause and take a look at things. So we appreciate that opportunity to take a look. And in that spirit, let's open it up for some questions.
Gloria, this is Ron. You can see me on the screen. I just had a couple just very general random questions. First of all, I'm wondering, just for myself, do you have within this material something for a layperson such as myself to understand actually in a definitional sense what is exactly entailed within the three words, diversity, equity, and inclusion? Of course, those are words we use in the vernacular, and I'm sure that those will fall short of what you have in your study here. So if that's in here, I'll look forward to it. I just skimmed through the past couple of minutes, but I noticed on, I think it's page 16, you had 5 groups of folks that were interviewed. And I was thinking too, within the whole notion of implicit bias and sometimes even overt bias, there are other categories of people such as age, physique, cultural backgrounds. Was any of that stuff considered or maybe worked in with the 5 categories you did choose?
Gloria, if I may, I do have an answer to Ron, your first question there. Yes. So
hello. I'm a brother Billiken. Hello.
Hello, go Billikens. Have to explain it to all our loved ones what a Billiken is. It's always tough.
It's a secret group. We don't have to.
So Maya and I actually did a lot of the interviews and focus groups. And one of the things that we did is we actually had definitions of diversity, equity, inclusion that we provided to all individuals. So our definition for diversity was a broad range of individual differences among people, such as but not limited to race, gender identity, ability, socioeconomic status, sexual orientation, veteran status, experience, background, etc. Inclusion, the involvement and integration of individual diversity into the organizational systems and processes throughout all areas and levels of the organization. And equity, the guarantee of fair treatment, access, and opportunity, while also identifying and eliminating barriers that have presented the full participation of some groups.
Okay, so within this, we also consider persons who might be from a different perspective, physical abilities, age, that sort of thing.
Definitely.
Okay, good. And then within the groups, I think there were, like you said, 5 groups, and each group had 6 or 7 folks that were actually active participants in it. Was that right?
We actually had, I think the lowest we had in one group was 7 individuals, and the most we had was 15. And that's where we capped it at, was 15.
Okay, good. And then another thing, I think on page 23 here, there's talk of lack of transparency in decision-making. And I'm just thinking, again, I haven't reflected on it, but just my current reaction is, within the headquarters here, there are high-level decisions over $60 million a year, and there's just a flood of data coming in that our executives have to handle. And by the time it filters through to the people who actually have to do the work, I'm sure there's going to be a host of questions that could arise. And I'm wondering if there could be a very onerous burden on the executives here to ensure communicating the whole decision-making process and even how feasible that is.
Yes, that actually echoes something that we've heard working with other library systems. And I think when we first were talking with Steve about it, Steve said this has been an issue for libraries and MCPL specifically for a number of years, is that communication. And I think the biggest thing is that people understand a lot of decisions are being made, but they're maybe not getting the broad what or the broad why. And that's more what people wanted to know. People, at least I found that people are generally pretty open, receptive to doing things if they can understand the why or what the thought was behind that, or even if they were given a voice at the table. That's part of why we recommended DEI councils, making sure that even if I don't have the opportunity to, or even if my ideas aren't fully bought into, at least we have the opportunity to weigh in. So I think probably some of that explanation that, we consulted this group or we talked to this group of employees is an important part of that. Just making sure that everyone feels like their voice is heard.
And thank you. The last question, I promise, is for your other clients that have incorporated a council, is there a general approach as to how the councils fit within the organizational structure of the libraries?
I'll take that one. Yes, a council is a best practice, as we said earlier, and there are some things to think about the structure. We know that councils work best when there are at least two leaders. We know that councils need a charter of some sort. We know it is also very beneficial for the council to allow people to be included in the process to determine who's on the council. But there are times when there are hardwired positions for a council, such as HR. That could be a hardwired position. Other companies we work in, they have unions. And so union reps, shop stewards may be on the council. So we looked at what you would need to set up a council based on best practices, but also there are certain nuances, challenges, changes that you need to make based on the organization, the culture. And I want to go back to something else that was asked about definitions. We gave you definitions so that we could get information from you. We gave you some basic DEI definitions so that there was common understanding. But a part of the council is also to set up what does DEI mean for your organization. So defining it, customizing it for your organization, mission, vision, and values. But the next step for the council after the leaders are selected, all the members are in place, is training on roles, responsibilities, how to put together a charter. That is standard for all councils, for all of the clients that we work with. Council roles or council expectations may be a little different based on what the organization needs and what the data says, but the principles of a council are the same. You also need a sponsor, an executive leader. And I believe, Steve, if I'm speaking out of school, please let me know, but I think you're the sponsor for that council. You need someone in the C-suite, an executive team member, to be the council sponsor because they need a conduit between what they are doing and what executive leadership is going to approve and assist and support them with. So that's kind of the foundation that has been set up thus far.
And Gloria, if I may, so I want Ron and actually everyone on this committee is always worried about my work-life balance and taking on too many things. Although I'm the sponsor of this organization, there are leaders on this on this council as well. And the two designated leaders are Rochelle Farmer and Courtney Meyer. And I think most of you have met Rochelle at some point or another. Courtney's newer, and you may not have met Courtney before, but she's involved with our recruitment. And she also has a history of working in this subject matter in her previous job. And so, and they're the two that are going to sort of be carrying the weight, carrying the water on this. I'm the sponsor. And so part of our issues, as Aaron mentioned, we've had previous efforts, and sometimes our efforts have kind of petered out at certain levels. And one of the reasons why is because there wasn't someone, as Gloria said, at the C-suite that was sponsoring this. You know, sort of a ground up, and eventually you hit to a certain level and you end it. Or sometimes it was a top down where the people in my office, whether it was me or Dick Wilding or Paul White, were interested, and you'd get to a certain level and it kind of peter out. We think it's different this time because the council itself is a cross-functional team too. It's not all managers. It's going to be frontline folks. It's going to be pages. It's going to be maintenance. It's going to be the whole gambit, cross-functional team. And so we feel it's going to be what I like to call top down, bottom up, and middle out this time. And so it's structured differently. And because it's structured differently, I think it's going to work differently. And because we have our guides with us, our Sherpas, I think we have a better chance that this is going to work this time. It's a little bit more unstructured, but I think it's important to underscore those points.
Thank you, Ron. Those were excellent.
If I could go back on my word, I promise I was last. One more. I'm just wondering, and it's only happens because my granddaughter's at Missouri right now. I look across the campus and see the faces. I'm wondering, is there a built-in issue with regard to diversity from the number of kids that are graduating from departments of library sciences? Is that something that we have to face? I don't know. I mean, the pipeline of new talent coming in, is that by the composition and population of that, you know, the new kids that are coming into the workforce, do we have maybe a lack of reflection within the broader community based on the kids who are going to be looking for jobs?
That is a theme we heard. I think last I read that maybe like across all the programs, like a Master's of Library Science program is 97% white, if I'm not mistaken. It's within a percentage point, I feel like, or so of there. But one of the things that we heard in the interviews and focus groups is reevaluating some of those degree requirements, especially at entry-level positions. A lot of times previous library experience or a degree in library science is valued, but not necessarily for a lot of jobs, specifically because Mcpl does a lot of internal hiring. And so what we heard time and time again is that you can teach some of these library knowledge on the job, but you can't teach people skills. You can't teach problem solving. So we heard that a little bit, is reevaluating some of these requirements to make sure that they don't produce this adverse impact.
And I think too, Ron, another issue is if people in certain communities aren't seeing themselves in the library branches, aren't seeing themselves in the library system, then they don't see that as a viable alternative.
Yeah, but I'm picking up what Aaron is saying, is that if the managers and the assistant branch managers all look like a 50-year earlier version of me, because they need the degree in library sciences, you know, is it, what do we do? Yes.
Some of the things our other clients have done, some of our clients are in the area of STEM. And so they recognize that they may have to start recruiting from high school, junior high, having programs in place with volunteers and having a community outreach to educate people about careers in their industry. So by the time you get to college, you already know about library science or have an interest. The other thing we found out, it's expensive for, what is it, 5 years? And so the other part of that is, do you have the flexibility to help people with even tuition? There's just a number of things that you can think about and do. One of the recommendations is about recruiting and hiring. I would also add to that retention, because you want to get people in, but you want them to stay as well. So a lot of things DEI councils look at is developing a DEI recruiting strategy and retention strategy. And you do have to start early. It's not by the time you get out of high school that you know about the library at the junior high level, what the opportunities are. And as Aaron mentioned, looking at other degrees that you might consider as valuable and transferable skills to the library.
Thank you. Any questions from our board members online? Now is an opportunity.
Hello, this is Yummy. I have a question.
Okay, go ahead, Yemi.
Okay, I was wondering sort of about your statistics. When you say that we are not diverse in certain areas, or maybe that we are in others, is that compared to the population of individual branches, or how do you get that? How are you coming up with that?
I'll let Maya speak to the employee demographic evaluation, but from what I said from the interviews and focus groups, that's purely anecdotal, what employees themselves are seeing and perceiving. But I'll let Maya speak to the actual evaluation.
Sure. So we ended up looking at employee data from all branches together. We were able to break it out by branch, but that wasn't necessarily what we were looking for, just because we were doing a high level overview. But essentially what we looked at was just generally where the diversity was, how it related. We also did look into some of the diversity in the area, like just in the community in general, just as a comparison. And what we found was that there wasn't a whole lot of racial diversity, which was one of the main things that we did find. And what we mean by diversity is not necessarily just making sure that there's people who are people of color involved, but also that there's a lot of gender diversity, which was something that was also lacking. And this is pretty common amongst a lot of different library systems, where a lot of the same demographic tends to be employed by libraries. Specifically, it's usually like women from the ages of 40 to 60 that are white. That just tends to be like a common demographic. And so we were seeing how much it broke out of that common demographic to compare.
Okay, so my question is, so I think as Steve mentioned earlier, that one of our goals is to see that the library, I guess it sort of looks like the community around it. So I'm just saying, is there anything that you did in regard to that so we can see, does our staff, does that look like the community?
Right. And so that's something that we always consider whenever we're looking at diversity. So certain branches may be more like, say, in a white demographic, just because the community is also very much in a white demographic. Our main points of concern is whenever there's branches that don't reflect the diversity of the community and it's still maintaining that same white demographic. And that was present in some of the branches. But like I said, we didn't want to do that full breakout just because that was a bit too comprehensive to where the audit level was supposed to be at. That is something that can be done in the future, though, to kind of look at the differences between the branches to see how it matches with that specific area of the community. And that's something that we do encourage. Because, if nothing else, making sure that there's diversity throughout all branches is absolutely great. But we also want to just make sure that the branches that are specifically in the communities that do have more diversity are matching. Because we know that there can be instances where people who are more diverse in certain aspects get put into branches that they don't match their community, and that could also cause some issues there for them. So we want to make sure that all the employees are feeling safe and comfortable and secure while they're working in their branches. And we also want to make sure that the patrons of the branches are coming and seeing themselves in the employees, so that way they feel comfortable with coming up to the branch staff and making sure that they can talk with them about issues that maybe are related to them, find different parts of the collection that would relate more to them, and so forth.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you. Other questions?
Yeah, I just had another one based on what you had mentioned. If you can clarify for me, the point of diversity, did you say that it's the employee's perception that we're not diverse? the employee perception versus, in fact, going through the personnel records and determining, for example, the race of the number of employees? One is quantitative, one is perception of a fraction of the employee base.
We look at both, yes. That's why we use that approach to make sure, you know, we've done it before where we've had it, where we do interviews and people say, yeah, very diverse organization. And when we look at the employee demographics, it's contained to one department up to one hierarchy level. So we want to make sure we look at both things and that we're having that well-rounded perspective. So this case, the quantitative data backed up the employee perception as well.
I think we had a question online.
I have a question. It's Michelle, whenever.
Okay, who's after you, Michelle? Who else has a question?
Rita?
Okay, so we'll go Michelle and then we'll go Rita.
How much did this study cost?
I think our budget was, we're not finished with it yet, but I think it was, Steve, 50, 54. I'll have to go back and look. But that's what our proposal was.
54.
1,000.
1,000 for the audit, and for the first stages of implementation.
Yeah.
Okay.
Can I go back to something just for a minute? Because it's a real important point about perception versus actual data. Much of this, when we do interviews and focus groups and surveys, it is how people see the world from where they are. But what is really important is perceptions are people's reality and truth, whether it's what the numbers say or not. So you have to manage to perceptions as well. But as Aaron said, perception and data matched here. But many times, and this is a very personal topic for people. Sometimes when you're talking about DEI, it can be very emotional for people. And so we do have to really take in consideration and not discount perceptions, but manage to people's perceptions with giving them accurate information, data, having a communication plan, which is something that we have been working with the library on, is helping with messaging and communications. Because if you don't see what you perceive to be as diversity as being at the library, that's your perception, and we have to manage to that.
Okay. Did you have another question, Michelle?
No, I don't.
Okay, we'll move on to Rita.
Yes. When I think of the library, I think that one of our most prevalent words that we use is literacy. And literacy says that a child is able to read and understand, and an adult can come for a class in English and be able to understand what the English language says. When school children are taken out of the public schools, the government schools, and tested to go into private schools, they fall behind by about 2 grade levels. So a 4th grader will be at 2nd grade level. An 8th grader will be at 6th grade level. This says amazing things for literacy. How do you address that with DEI?
Rita, I think that's out of the scope of this particular audit. This audit was basically dealing with our personnel, dealing with our hiring practices, our policies and procedures around our employees, and how our welcoming and inclusive is a space for our employees. So I think that that's out of the scope of this particular audit, but it's something that we as a library should always be looking at.
Well, and what I'd like to add, if I could, Joyce,
Hello?
is
Just a
Rita.
second.
Hello?
Yeah, Rita.
Yes. May I continue?
Well,
I think that the purpose
Yeah.
for having a library is for our patrons, right? Not for our employees. And if our patrons are falling behind like 2 grade levels, shouldn't we be focused on that rather than on the happiness of our employees? You can say yes or no. I don't care. You can explain if you want.
I would say both, Rita. It doesn't have to be either or.
And
We are an employer. We're a library, but we're also an employer, so we need to pay attention to both from a value standpoint and from a standpoint, we have a legal obligation, we have an ethical obligation, so we need to be a good faith employer.
Well, that would fall into the values range, right? What do you value? Do you value literacy, or do you value keeping your employees happy?
Doesn't have to be either or, it can be both, in my opinion.
Where does merit come in?
Merit?
Merit, yes. Diversity, inclusion, equity. And are we looking for quality librarians, or just those who are diverse, inclusive, and want equity?
I think what the audit is attempting to do, Rita, is to address the aspects of our hiring practices that have no impact on the quality of the work performed, so that we are more inclusive, that people aren't automatically excluded because they are other or they are different. And I think that we also have a legal obligation beyond just a ethical obligation to do that as a public entity and as a public library. I think that we need to take a look at our hiring practices and making sure that we're hiring to the positions. And just because someone fills a typical role that has been in a library does not mean that that is necessarily the best person to serve our communities. That's my opinion.
Okay, who is speaking there? I didn't hear our names with it. Someone from Hicks or someone from the library?
It's Joycelyn.
Who?
Joycelyn. Personnel Chair, Joycelyn.
It's garbled. I can't understand it. Sorry. When are you going to do an audit on the people?
It's Joycelyn from the Personnel Committee that had been replying to.
Joycelyn, okay, right. When are we going to do an audit on the patrons, what they want?
we do on an ongoing basis. That's what when we have our customer, every quarter when Katina shows us things like our customer engagement and our net promoter scores, that information comes from our customer engagement and asking what our customers want and responding to that.
Are you looking at that also in the lens of diversity, equity, and inclusion?
Frankly, no. That's been part of our problem. I think that we need to be looking through all of our decision-making through a diversity, equity, and inclusion lens and see what the impact of that is. I mean, in reference to your previous question, Rita, I think that it is important that we look at the diversity of our clientele because I don't want to argue your statistics. Your statistics may be right that people need us as an institution in order to be in order to compete, in order to raise grade levels and things. You may be absolutely right with that, but I think that children that are in at-risk situations are going to be more responsive to us and more responsive to our literacy help if they can see people who have shared experiences, whether they're just personal experiences or whether they can see themselves in other people. That's why diversity is important. It just makes it easier for our clientele to be able to connect with the people that are trying to serve them.
Another question?
Go
Have you
ahead.
been following the critical race theory that has engaged so many parents in pushing back on their schools? Because critical race theory also involves diversity, inclusion, and equity. And parents are just finding out about it thanks to COVID when this came home because the computers came home and the parents realized what their children were learning. The parents are not happy. We have some of those parents in our school districts. I think they need also to be involved and listened to.
In terms of this audit, Rita, I believe that's kind of off topic. We're talking about back of house issues with our employees.
I think that we're losing our clientele. If we're focused on employees, we're losing our clientele because we have two quite rural counties in the 3-county library group.
Do you have any other, are you finished, Rita?
Yes,
questions?
that'll be
Okay.
it for now.
Do we have any other questions? Now is the time to ask because this is our in-depth presentation for the committee. The committee always got a more in-depth questionings and presentation. Noelle, did you have anything? Yeah.
I mean, she was on, but she was in a
Okay.
loud area, so she still may not feel comfortable unmuting, so.
Okay.
There was a question.
Go ahead.
There was a question regarding the amount of the contract, and I quoted 54,000. It is actually 53,000. I needed to go back and pull up the contract. So that's how much the DEI assessment and the work that we are doing cost.
Thank you for verifying that, Gloria.
Okay. I would encourage anyone with further questions to either, email me or call me or call Mr. Potter, and we'll be glad to take those questions. And if we need a further response before the meeting, that we can have that. However, I think that what we have here is an outsider objective view on both reality and perception of DEI, looking at it through the lens of best practices. And I think that is valuable in our role as employers, in our role as good faith employers within the state of Missouri, to make sure that our policies, practices, and procedures are fair and equitable for our employees, and that all our employees have a chance to succeed. In the nature of that, given if there are no further questions, all that would be left would be to just accept the audit report, and I would take a motion to accept it. Doesn't mean that we're going to implement everything tomorrow or everything at all, but to accept that we've received this report and accept that we've taken this moment to take a look at our policies, procedures, and practices. So at this time, I'd look for a motion to accept the report.
So moved, it's Yummy.
Okay, thank you, Yummy.
Yeah, second.
We have a second from Ron. Any further comments before we take a vote? Okay, all those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed?
Aye. Rita?
Okay, I'm sorry. I had a lot going on here. I'm having to step outside. I didn't hear what we're voting on. This is Michelle.
We're voting on a motion to accept the report, just to accept that we've received it and we've heard it and it's been presented to us.
Okay, Yummy, I just want to ask you something for clarification, if I may, Joycelyn.
Yes.
And that is, I believe we are not voting to accept anything that, like we're in agreement or disagreement. We are just accepting that we've heard it. I just want to clarify the motion.
Yes.
That is correct.
And, we will make a report out to the full board. Any other questions?
Yes, a question. If we accept this, then it goes to the full board as something that they should accept also. And I think that there still is much more discussion that needs to be had on this with the trustees, so I will not accept this.
Hey, Rita, it's Michelle. I don't think that's what it is. I think it's just that they presented it. I think that we're accepting it, that it was presented, not that anybody agrees or disagrees. That's just my understanding.
No, you're correct, Michelle.
That's it, Michelle, you got it. It's actually, if I may, it's the exact same process that we use with the audit, the financial audit.
Okay, so we still have time. We still have time to talk about it and all the things, right?
Sure, yes, yes.
Okay.
Well, and like any other action of a committee, the action of the committee is always a recommendation. Any sort of actual action of the board comes from the full board, not from the committee, so.
And keep in mind that these recommendations are back of house recommendations that primarily fall within the purview of our director, not the board. Now, policy definitely involves the board, and we provide oversight and evaluation of our director on how policy is implemented.
So if I may, we've sort of had some clarification of the motion and what the motion means. So if it's okay in terms of rules, can we call the question again and do the vote again? Because I'm not sure.
Yeah, we haven't voted yet.
We haven't voted yet.
Yeah, okay.
So,
And I need to get clarification on who first and second also, I believe.
Yeah, we did vote, yeah.
Yummy made the motion and Ron second.
Thank you.
So, and then we started taking the vote, but then clarification, so.
So if it's okay with everyone present, we re-clarify the motion and retake the vote so that we're making sure that we have clarified, that you are clear with what we're voting on. Is it okay with all the members present?
This is Michelle. It's okay with me now. I appreciate it.
Okay. We're accepting a motion. We're taking, the motion would be to accept the report as given.
Just to accept the report.
To accept the report.
And recommend.
And recommended for presenting it to the full
present it to
board.
the full board.
Is that clear? Accepting the report and we'll present it to the full board. Okay. Let's try this again. All those in favor, please, actually, can you do a roll call?
Yes,
That's
absolutely.
easier.
I'm gonna start with Noelle because she's already sent me her yes. She had to leave.
Okay.
Yummy,
Okay, yes.
Ron,
Yes.
Rita,
No,
Michelle,
Yes. Could you hear me? I'm sorry.
Yeah, we got you. We got you, Michelle.
On my
Sorry.
AirPod and,
No,
sorry.
we
Okay,
got you.
thank you.
Joyce.
Thank you. Yes. Okay. Thank you. Any other
Carries 5-1.
Hmm?
Carries 5-1.
carries? Okay, the vote carries 5-1. Thank you so much to Hicks Carter Hicks. Do you have any final wrap up or?
No, just thank you for the opportunity to work with the library and to continue our work to help serve you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right,
Thank you.
bye-bye.
Bye-bye. And next up, we're talking about Juneteenth.
Okay, and I asked that we put this on the agenda. You might remember, or might not if you're like me, that in June of last year, there was a move to create a new federal holiday, Juneteenth. And also several municipalities recognized the holiday, and the state of Missouri recognized it as a holiday, but not as a paid holiday. It's been a very long time since there's been a new recognized federal holiday. In fact, I think it was the Martin Luther King birthday holiday was the last one that we probably dealt with. But we have a new federal holiday, and I wanted to bring an opportunity for discussion on what we might want to do as an organization around Juneteenth. If I may, talking just a little bit more about the conversation you and I had about Juneteenth. It isn't really, as I said, it's not really 100% clear as to what everyone is doing. I mean, there's a federal holiday. There are several cities that have that are recognizing this. The state is not fully recognizing this. We are under no obligation to recognize every federal holiday. In fact, yesterday was Columbus Day and we were open. The library doesn't recognize every holiday. A couple of years ago, we re-adopted our holiday days off and gave all of our salaried benefits eligible employees 3 floating holidays. Frankly, because we thought that it could be beneficial for people to be able to celebrate the things that were important to them. So, if you are an environmentalist and you want to celebrate Earth Day, you can use one of your floating holidays to celebrate Earth Day. Or if you wanted to celebrate Ramadan, you could use one of your holidays to do that, but the library would still be open. I'm still not sure, based on what my friends in the library community are saying. I questioned them about what they're doing with Juneteenth. They're all over the board right now. And there's no real consensus as to how this is going to be celebrated as a holiday nationally. Is it going to just be a 3-day weekend like Labor Day? We don't know. So staff would recommend that the library acknowledge Juneteenth as a federal holiday and to allow staff members to use that, one of their floating holidays if they wish to be off, and then come back and revisit this in a couple of years when there's been some more establishment into how everyone else is celebrating it, and then we can sort of fall into line. But I did feel like it was worth having a conversation with the committee and the board as to what we may want to do.
So if I understand, it's not an additional paid holiday, it just expands the scope of opportunities to exercise the current number of floaters.
Right. But and keeping the current number of floating holidays. I'm not recommending that we increase the number of floating holidays or anything at this particular time. My recommendation is that we just sort of hold the line for a couple of years until we can figure out how this is going to be celebrated and commemorated.
And part of the conversation I had with Mr. Potter was this allows employees to exercise their desire to participate in Juneteenth by taking a holiday. But it also allows the library to participate by being open with Juneteenth information, searching, programming, anything that the communities may desire. And then, you know, as we see how this goes forward, it can always be revisited. Others?
We can move to the next topic. I mean, there's no
Okay, we'll
need
move
for
to the
a
next
vote.
topic.
Yeah.
Yeah, all right. Next up was an item that was referred to the committee. The library and the committee has received, and the board, I should say, has received a letter requesting us to revisit the COVID payments that were looked at earlier to help to offset the effects of COVID based on our employees' performance during that time. And this was a request to extend that additional funds to our employees that are part-time, are not salaried, who were affected at that time. I've had conversations with both HR and with Mr. Potter. And at this time, in looking at this, basically what is requested would constitute a bonus, and libraries are prohibited from bonuses. Any payment has to be connected with performance and work that was done. We can't give people by statute, by law, we can't do that by law. So we're unable to do this at the time. I would like to say that we value all of our employees, very much so, and that's one of the reasons why we put in place the employee assistance programs and some of the other services that our employees were able to take advantage of at that time. But we are prohibited by law from doing what was requested. Do you have anything to add?
Yeah, just to really drive the point home is that what was asked for in the letter was that we should give everybody an equal amount of resilience pay, whatever you want to call it, extra money. Everybody, it doesn't say this in the letter, but just for the sake of argument, everybody gets $500. That by definition legally is a bonus, and governmental entities are prohibited by law from giving a bonus. Now, you can, as Joycelyn was saying, you can tie performance to additional pay. So you do a good job, you get extra money. You meet certain goals, you get extra money. You work certain number of hours, you get extra money. And that's what we did here. This resiliency, COVID resiliency pay was based on the amount of time that you worked. It did, of course, shortchange the people who worked less, but in order to provide equal treatment as requested in the letter, we would be violating the law, so.
Any questions on that? Okay. Moving on to preliminary insurance report.
This is good news, I think. I believe this is really good news. And I saw Jennifer's name pop up there on the screen a little while ago, so I know she's listening. But what we basically have from Blue Cross and Blue Shield in Lockton is that our current run rate, in fact, let me see if I can actually get this. I'll actually pull this directly from the report that Jennifer sent to us. So there's a paragraph in here, and I'll just read it real quickly. It says, in consideration of additional claims data, Lockton reforecast our 21-22 plan costs down by 1.8%. If claims run as expected for the remainder of the fiscal year, we will be within the healthcare plan budget without any changes to plan design or dependent premiums paid by employees who cover their families. So that's the good, I mean, that's top line, top line information is we're in great shape. If you pay attention in Quan's report, and he talks to you about the healthcare reserve fund, you know that we are toward the top, if not a little bit overfunded with our reserve fund, which again, it puts us in great shape. Some of you, well, I know a couple of years ago, at this time of year, we had kind of the opposite news and we had to do a plan design change or recommended a plan redesign change in the middle of the, you know, at this time of year in October, November. We won't have to do that this year. And if you look at the report, the letter that we have in here, you can kind of see that in 2018 that we've got this thing as HCC, which is which are high cost claimants, which we have stop loss insurance, which essentially means once your claim gets above a certain amount, then we have the reinsurance and we stop hitting that. But our high cost insurers, there were 20 in 2018, 27 in 2019, 23 in 2020, but then so far 12 this year. That's part of why we're seeing things trend in the positive direction that we are. There's other things like our health and wellness. There's many other different reasons that we're looking at. Now, the other two things, well, before shifting out of healthcare, it's hard to say what the future is going to hold. I mean, right now, there's a lot of reports that I've read that are saying that people are putting off voluntary medical activity, which means that, you know, once people stop putting off those voluntary surgeries and procedures and things, then we are liable to see some increases again. I think to that end, Lockton is suggesting that, or they're projecting that we could see some increases in the following year. But for this year so far so good. The other thing to keep in that we always look at this time of year, dental insurance. Our dental insurance is going to increase, but our dental insurance has been the same since 2016.
Oh.
So, so yeah, it's probably due to increase. The thing about dental insurance is that generally dental insurance it's sort of a passive PPO. It's not terribly expensive anyway. So even at a 6% increase, it's still within our budget. And that's what we're looking to do. The other real big change is our employee assistance program, our EAP, which we have leaned on quite a bit over the last 2 years. We will be changing providers for that. Part of that is because New Directions had been sort of embedded with Blue KC with our insurance company, and that relationship ended. And when that relationship ended, it got super expensive. So we sort of put it out to bid, and we found a new company that will be getting so we'll still have our employee assistance program. That's the important thing. We'll be getting it from a different place, but we put it out to market to make sure that we were doing the right thing and getting the best price for it. So the bottom line for today's conversation is insurance is great. That we are in really good shape in terms of where we are with our insurance. I don't have a crystal ball, so I can't tell you what's going to happen in the future, but no need for a plan redesign change, no need for additional funding. Generally good news. Jennifer, I'm not sure if you're in a position to add anything. Do you want to add anything?
I'm fine.
Okay.
I turned the AC off in this room because it was so loud, but no, I think that overall, I feel good about where we're at, but also with always the same trepidation with health costs. It's very difficult to predict what will happen, but I do trust Lockton to help us. So one of the things that we will be doing as we do open enrollment for 1/1/22 is, including a heads up for our staff that there is the potential that there may be a plan design change or some kind of change around insurance for 2023. There always is, but because of how well the plan has performed over the last few years, we haven't had to do much. And that is a credit to, how our employees use their health insurance and how, that they are good consumers of healthcare and the things that they do personally and that they participate in when it comes to wellness. But medical costs are what they are and claims are what they are. So we will be looking at it again, as we always do, and to see if there's something that we need to do differently for 1/1/23. But we can stay the course for 1/1/22.
Thank you. Any questions on the insurance report? Okay, do we have any other business?
I know of nothing.
Okay.
And just to verify, we do have the public comment on all public meetings. We didn't have any public comment for this meeting, correct?
No.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. And I'll take a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Okay, it's been moved. Do we have a second? Otherwise, we'll be here all night.
No.
Do we have a second?
I think they're gone.
Is everyone gone? I think so.
That's a de facto.
Can I second? I'll second.
This is Yummy. I'll second. Sorry.
Okay, thank you.
Okay,
Yummy
thank you.
seconded. Thank you. I didn't want to spend the night here.
My
All right.
mute button, my
All
mute
those in
button.
favor? Aye, we're